I'm very much looking forward to sharing what I know with you. I've been doing this for 25 years now, digging around in the psychology and neuroscience literature to try and find bits of it that are useful and relevant to our everyday working lives, and then sharing it with all and sundry. So I do it through 3 different means. I call what I do Neuroscience ABC. A is for author. I wrote a book, became a bestseller. I wrote a few more. B is for broadcaster. I presented a load of brain-related stuff on started out on BBC, moved on to a primetime Sky One thing, went on to Discovery, did a couple of sort of ad hoc appearances on This Morning, The Ranga Nation, even Celebrity Big Brother, would you believe? And then C, the consultancy part of the business is sometimes working behind the scenes, working on strategy, usually some kind of communication campaign, or this kind of thing. This is my favorite, live talks in front of real people where I can get a bit of feedback. So today, as mentioned, I'll be talking a little bit about how brains make decisions, primarily with a view to helping you get the people you work with to make the decisions you need them to make sure the insights that you produce land and are acted upon as much as possible. I'll then talk to you about neuroplasticity, how even adult brains can change. I'll then move on to the topic of technology in the brain and how sometimes the brains can change in a manner that doesn't necessarily suit your long-term best interests. And then I'll finish up with something which I call Gen Brain. There is a little bit of early research into what generative AI might be doing to our cognitive capacities. And then I'll leave you with some advice on how I would recommend any owner of a brain could dodge Gen Brain. So, the neuroscience of decisions. If you want to understand how brains make decisions, you need to get to know this part of the brain. This is a brain looking in this direction. If you were to sort of cut my head right down the middle, open it up at the center fold, this is what you'd see. And here you have the ventral tegmental area. This is where all of the dopamine in your brain is manufactured. It's in the midbrain. It sits on top of the brainstem, which sits on top of the spinal cord. And the VTA sends its dopaminergic neurons into a variety of different brain areas. We've got some into the prefrontal cortex, some deep into a core brain area called the dorsal striatum. But this sort of unobtrusive looking green pathway to the nucleus accumbens is the reward pathway. And it's fundamental to all the decisions that you've ever made and all the decisions that anyone's ever made, really. So we're going to focus on what MRI scans. I actually did my PhD not 5-minute walk from here. All my scanning was done at Queen Square. And if you stick someone in an MRI scanner and give them various different kind of stimuli, you can get this brain area to light up. So if someone is hungry and you give them food, the VTA will light up. If someone's thirsty and you give them some kind of liquid refreshment, the VTA will light up. And if you sexually stimulate someone in a scanner, the VTA will light up. And I've met the guy who's done this research, and yes, he is based in the Netherlands. So why does the VTA light up? What do all these 3 things have in common? Well, they make us feel happy. But you may never have thought this. It's quite interesting to reflect on why do we even feel pleasure in the first place? Like, what purpose does it serve? Evolution doesn't really care about whether we're happy or sad. It just cares about survival. Well, pleasure is the motivation to actually do work to achieve a certain goal. That's the way to think about it. So quenching our thirst, satisfying our hunger, surviving for long enough to reach sexual maturity and passing our genes on to the next generation. If there hadn't been an unbroken chain of people doing these important goals, all the way back to when our ancestors were fish swimming around in the ocean, none of us would be here. So the reward pathway is fundamental to the survival of our species and all mammalian species for that matter. You can also short circuit it. You can get the VTA to light up with various chemicals, some of them legal, some of them illegal, some of them very innocuous, like a delicious piece of chocolate. All of these substances have been given to someone in a brain scanner, and they all make the VTA light up and give varying degrees of pleasure. The nucleus accumbens, where all that dopamine gets actually released once the electrical messages reach the end of the reward pathway. This brain area is much more interesting. It enables us to predict the future. Not in a kind of supernatural way, as this slide misleads you into believing, but more in the sense that the activity in the nucleus accumbens reflects the brain's prediction. It's making a reward prediction. If I went for this option over that option, how much reward would it deliver? So it's estimating future rewards, importantly on the basis of past experience, of similar scenarios. So let's say you're deciding what you're going to have for lunch, something you do every single day that you have extensive experience of doing. You consider, will I have the tuna and sweet corn sandwich? Will I have the pasta arrabbiata or indeed the chicken cutlet? So if your nucleus accumbens gives these kind of signals, we're imagining the more activity, the more heavily it weighs on this side of the scale, then given this profile, because you absolutely love the sandwich, you had pasta last night, and the last time you had a chicken cutlet from that place, it made you feel a bit sick, and you still haven't got over the negative experience. On that particular day, this is the option you will go for. But you don't necessarily do it on a conscious level. One thing that you need to remember when considering these responses in the reward pathway is that they are all processed on an unconscious basis. So you're probably aware that what we're consciously aware of is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what the brain can do as a whole. In fact, our conscious brain can only handle 11 bits of information per second, whereas the unconscious, full unconscious processing of the brain handles 11 million bits per second. So there's a lot going on down there deep in our unconscious that we have no idea about. And when it comes to decision making, we sometimes will get some kind of stirring somewhere in our body. Usually we call it a gut feeling. So that is what we're consciously aware of. But the truth of the matter is, we've made the decision when we come to tell other people the decision we made, long before we come to retrospectively come up with rational explanations for why we've done that. There's lots of evidence to show we make a decision sometimes several seconds before we're aware that we've reached that decision. The main insight here is, if you have extensive experience in a certain decision-making situation, you can trust your gut feeling. But if, for example, you've never bought a house before, and then you go and look at 4 or 5 houses, you will still get a gut feeling on which one is the best option, but it will likely be misleading because you don't have sufficient evidence for that unconscious processing to guide you well. That gut feeling needs, under those circumstances, more data, more research. You need to essentially gather lots of data and crunch it and lean harder on the data than on your gut feeling. So I'm going to talk to you about the power of surprise. The power of surprise is very useful in the sense that if you stick someone in a brain scanner, this is my world, this is what an MRI scan looks like, and you can tune it up. Usually if you've had one of these in the doctor, they're interested in the structure of the tissues that they're scanning. In this case, we're looking at the activity level in different brain areas under various circumstances. So this is from the neuroeconomic literature. We're going to talk about gaining and losing money. This young lady's gained 100 pounds. To try and bring it to life a little bit, let's say this gain of 100 pounds was expected because she did a shift in her local pub. And at the end of the shift, the landlord, always keen to dodge taxes, hands her an envelope of money with 100 pounds in it. And at the moment of receiving that money, that young lady would feel pretty happy. And in keeping with that, there'd be a sort of moderate increase in activity in the nucleus accumbens, reflecting the gain. But what do you think happens when that gain of 100 pounds, exactly the same unitary value, happens under circumstances where it comes as a surprise? Let's say someone in the course of the shift just gave her 100 quid tip out of the blue. What do you think happens in the nucleus accumbens? Any ideas? Brief audience interaction? Thank you. At the back. Upwards. Upwards by a lot? Upwards by a little? So it's not double. It's not quadruple. It's huge disproportionate increase in activity in the nucleus accumbens. Why? Well, the reason is that the brain is essentially a pattern detecting machine, and it's creating a model of how the world works. So under these circumstances, it's really important to broadcast a signal to the whole brain. I did not see that windfall coming. Stop, take stock. What is different about today than other times I've been in this situation? Was I on particularly good form? Was I particularly attentive to that table? Am I wearing a different outfit to the one I normally wear? You need to scrutinize what's going on so you can update the model with hypotheses so that you can put yourself in the way of those kind of windfalls again in the future. We don't like surprises. We like to minimize them wherever possible because otherwise we might be missing out on opportunity. So conversely, let's say she gets home from her shift. She's got her 100 quid in her pocket, but then she immediately has to hand it over to a housemate because she's got a debt to settle. So under those circumstances, it's an expected loss. What do you think happens in the nucleus accumbens under those circumstances? Well, I kind of cheated. I didn't tell you. There's a baseline level of activity, tick, 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 electrical messages passing through, and the frequency drops. The rate of those messages drops, signifying the loss of £100. But it was expected, so it's not terribly profound. But what happens if she gets off the bus, taps her back pocket, and finds that that money has gone unexpectedly? Same unitary loss, but under circumstances where it's unexpected. What do you think happens? Well, it will probably come as no surprise that it drops. But here's the interesting bit. You get a significant decrease. In fact, the reward pathway flatlines for a few seconds, which also broadcasts to the brain that something unusual has happened and the patterns of the world have not been spotted properly. And you'll notice that the size of that disproportionate drop in activity is much larger than the size of the disproportionate increase to the surprising gain. And this is why we humans are so loss averse. And quite often we don't bear this in mind when we are interacting with other people. So what can we do with this? When influencing other people's decisions, i.e. positioning the insights that your research has revealed in the best possible light, you need to think about what's going on in the reward pathways of the decision maker, and you need to be strategic with that expectation. Specifically, don't squander the surprise. If there is a surprising insight, something that's really gobsmacking and fascinating, do not give it away up front in your first few slides. In fact, do a Columbo. Remember this guy? He'd be leaving, there's a figuratively, everyone is leaving the room, and then turn around, and what do they say? By the way, I was thinking along the lines of, just one more thing. So you want to make them think that it's all done, and then you drop that amazing insight on primacy and recency. People remember what you say right at the beginning and right at the end. So if it's the last thing they hear, it's going to resonate. You're going to get a disproportionate rise of activity in the reward pathway, and it's much more likely to positively influence their decision. So the flip side of the story is about evaluating the cons. Obviously, if it's a really attractive option, but it's incredibly expensive, then you might not be going for it, no matter how good it seems, right? So there are two parts of the brain that evaluate the cons. The anterior cingulate is a part of the brain. So anterior just is a posh way of saying towards the front, right? Cingulate is, it means belt in Latin. It's a strip of brain which surrounds the bundle of neurons that connects the left and right sides of the brain, and it's in the frontmost compartment of that. This brain area in neuroeconomic studies is very interested in things that stick out from the norm. Pranay's last slide talked about spotting patterns. So if I were to go red, green, green, red, red, green, green, red, red, yellow, yellow, red, red, green, green, the yellow sticks out, right? This brain area is interested in that kind of thing, something that doesn't fit with everything else. It's also interested in uncertainty. If there's a high-risk option that's being evaluated and another one's low risk, it will produce a very strong signal to when there's a low probability of that positive thing arriving. It's also very interested in conflict. Anytime your brain or a decision maker's brain is having to evaluate conflicting information, which in a low signal to noise environment will be often, the anterior cingulate will get in the way of that decision because the conflict reduces certainty, in a manner of speaking. The other side of the equation is the anterior insula. This brain area is, you've probably heard of the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. There's a deep valley between the two of them, and deep down at the base of that valley is the insula. And again, it's the front part, the anterior part of the insula, which is very sensitive to disgust. So it could be you find stinky old lunchbox and there's horrible kind of rotten sandwiches in it. It's literally that feeling of revulsion where your stomach turns. The anterior insula is involved in generating those kind of feelings. But also anxiety, rather than fear being about something specific, anxieties tend to be generally about stuff, nasty stuff lurking in the future, and unease. So this brain area is going to respond to a horrible Halloween outfit, a food which is a delicacy in some parts of the world and not necessarily palatable to yourself. I was offered this by a neighbor the other day. I didn't jump at the chance. We've all been there, right? We know the feeling associated with that. And as I mentioned before, in these neuroeconomic studies, a big, strong anterior insular signal comes along when the price tag is much higher than expected. Doesn't matter how good the thing is, it would usually not be chosen. So how do you use this? I want you to think about the decision maker's anterior cingulate. I know it sounds bizarre. It's a way of dealing with possible objections to whatever kind of route your insight is suggesting you should go down, and a way of sort of compartmentalizing it, a tick box exercise. Have you dealt with the uncertainty and conflict that might surround that particular insight or that particular option? If you can reduce it, you'll reduce activity in the anterior cingulate, avoiding the possibility that that decision will not be reached. So directly addressing causes of uncertainty, if we know that a certain data type is a bit flaky, like what have you done specifically to address, mitigate the high-risk issues that the uncertainties involve? And if there are conflicting messages, so sometimes it's that the message you're sending goes against conventional wisdom, you need to directly address that. There's a tendency to sort of sweep it under the carpet and hope that it doesn't get in the way or it doesn't occur to them. Sometimes the insights within one data set will be conflicting. And yet, you might not even notice it because you're working at 1,000 miles per hour, but you need to spot these potential sources of conflict and explain them. It will make it much more likely that they will follow the route you are trying to get your stakeholders to take. And as similarly with the anterior insula, if you can anticipate their fears, if you can get to know where that individual that you're dealing with has been burned in the past, then you can sort of imagine what might be keeping them awake at night. Like, no matter how much you've Columboed them with your amazing insight, if it dawns on them that night and they're wide awake thinking, yeah, but we tried that a couple of years ago and it was an absolute disaster. If you know what that person has experienced negatively in the past, what makes them loss averse, you can confront that cause of past regret head on and deal with it whilst they're still there in the room with you. So the reality is it's two sides of the scales. The pros need to weigh heavily to make them choose that option, but also the cons need to stay light. And it doesn't matter whether it's choosing what you're going to have for lunch or whether it's about choosing how you're going to invest your life savings. It's exactly the same bunch of brain areas involved in reaching that decision. And it is not as rational as you might think. It is ridiculous the number of spurious things that can influence the activations in the reward pathway. We'll give you some examples, and then we'll move on to neuroplasticity. So, an attractive face of the person telling the story or delivering the insight or whatever will activate the nucleus accumbens more strongly than a neutral face. So this is why pharmaceutical sales reps are famously very attractive individuals, because the doctor in question that is being sold to will conflate the evidence in the detail aid with the beauty of that person. Same with a smiley face. Salespeople always talk, smile when you're talking on the phone. You don't even need to see the face. You can hear that the person's smiling. And the reason being that it has a positive impact on the reward pathway when evaluating the thing that's being sold. Halo effect. This is the classic way of explaining it. 14.5% of men in the United States are over 6 foot tall, yet they are disproportionately represented as CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. Nearly 60% of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are over 6 foot tall. Now, physical stature has absolutely nothing to do with your capacity to run a business, but if someone looks cosmetically like they would be a good leader, then people tend to follow them. The decision is made to employ them over someone who's of shorter stature, but possibly much, much more impressive as a leader. Trust signals, body language, it shouldn't really matter. If you've got really good insights, it shouldn't matter what the person's body language is like, right? But some people just don't like making eye contact. But if the person isn't making eye contact, then our ancient brain detecting body language signals will flag maybe a little bit of anxiety. Does this person really believe what they're saying? So the body language of the individual delivering that information can make a huge difference too. And this is a classic study, if you're a geek like me, 2011 Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, which is a pretty decent journal. On the horizontal axis, the x-axis, you've got the ordinal position of cases being evaluated by a panel of 3 judges. And it's just the order in which they were encountered on a given day. On the y-axis, we've got the proportion of favorable decisions. So this is a parole board. The favorable decision in question is all about were those prisoners granted their freedom, right? It's a pretty serious, rational decision, one would hope. Now, as you can see, there's a clear pattern in this data. What do you think the circled data point? Any guesses?
After a break.
Exactly, bang on the money. The first case to be evaluated after a break. So you also have to think about the physiological state of the decision maker at the time they're making the decision. Hunger, thirst, fatigue, all of these things, if they're not straight and their basic physiological requirements aren't being met, they're much less likely to see the value in the proposition. So anything that can influence reward pathways will potentially influence the ultimate decision. I'll just run through them really quickly. It's kind of obvious, right? But all I'm saying is that these things really do influence a person's reward pathways and therefore really do influence the decision. Sharp appearance, looking. I have a mate, he's like really bright and really great, but he's always got dog lint all over his jacket. And he doesn't seem to think that that might make people believe what he's got to say a little bit less. Like, you're all very polished. I don't need to tell you a lot about it, but it makes a difference, and it shouldn't do, on whether or not people believe the insights you'll be sharing with them. Body language. Confident will give a better impression than unsure. Comedy is an incredibly useful tool in a stressful environment. But I've been in encounters with people where they try to use comedy and it's a little bit crude and it has the opposite effect, right? Is the comedy appropriate to the audience in question? Demeanor, people who can stay calm under pressure compared to stressy people. Empathy, does the person seem like they actually genuinely care, or are they just going through the motions? This all makes a big difference. And then freshness. To what degree, just before that person is about to make a decision, can you get some food and drink into them and give them an opportunity to empty their bladder? If you have control of, now this might seem like obvious as furious, but Deloitte took this really to heart when they were pitching for the global Tesco auditing business. And over the last 10 years, it added 100 million to their bottom line. So take it seriously. Neuroplasticity. Brains are built to change. So this is not an artist's impression of the brain. This is another MRI scan, but this time, instead of focusing on the activation level in different brain compartments, it's focused on the structure of the brain, specifically the 86 billion neurons, which send electrical messages from one end to the other in your brain at 250 miles per hour every moment of every day. And then when it reaches the end of the line, it hits the all-famous synapse, the connection between one neuron and the next, spills a bit of neurotransmitter into that gap, and then when it plugs into a receptor on the other side, it basically makes that next neuron in the chain a little bit more likely or a little bit less likely to send electrical messages of its own. Well, what's missing from this story is it seems like these neurons are connected one-to-one, but actually each individual neuron is connected to thousands of other neurons in your brain. So that means there are more synapses in your brain than there are stars in our galaxy, the Milky Way. But that's not the cool bit. The cool bit is, thanks to the drivers of London's famous black cabs, we know that you can change the physical structure of your brain even in adulthood. So presumably you've heard that the drivers of London's famous black cabs have to do the knowledge. Familiar? So you have to memorize 320 major routes within a 6-mile radius of Charing Cross, and you have to memorize 6,000 locations of interest, museums, hotels, train stations, all of the above. It's an incredible feat of memorization. It takes a median of 2.2 years to complete it. It's pretty remarkable. So, in Queen Square, few years before I got there, a bunch of researchers got these wannabe drivers of taxi cabs before they did the knowledge, before they actually started the memorization process and scanned their brain. And then they scanned them once they've been awarded their Hackney carriage license. And what they found was that one part of the brain became physically larger and was more densely packed with synapses, thanks to all of the proteins being laid down to tighten up the connections in this particular brain pathway. And the brain area in question is called the hippocampus. Hippocampus means seahorse in Latin. And in the middle here, this actually is a human hippocampus. And as you can see, it looks rather remarkably like a seahorse. So it's the posterior hippocampus. The tail part of it was the part that was physically larger, more densely packed and heavier, if you like. But interestingly, that was what was responsible for helping them be able to, just off the top of their head, be able to describe any route around central London. So if you were to say you're in the Hoxton Hotel in Holborn, you've got to take your fare to Heathrow, but the A40 is closed and it's 4 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. Describe the route and everything you go past. They have to be able to do that without reference to any kind of sat-nav or map. All of that information is effectively stored in this region of their brain. And when they brought them back in a follow-up study after they'd retired, that brain area had shrunk back down to the kind of size you find in any of our brains. I'm assuming none of you are professional drivers. To use it or lose it with the brain, if you use certain pathways, your brain overnight will maintain and repair them and bolster them and improve them. It does it through a process of laying down more synapses, improving the connectivity, the efficiency of communication in that particular network. So the next time you come to do that particular task, you can do it a little bit better. The more often you practice, the more this process is driven through. So it means that you can have an impact on your own brain structure. The more you play the piano, daily is better than weekly, weekly is better than monthly, the more you'll be able to accelerate the process of brain change and improve your skills. So normally the story of neuroplasticity stops there, but I always like to sort of expand it ever so slightly because it's hugely relevant. This is another way of saying that the environment, or specifically the way we interact with our environment, can shape our brain. But we humans have an incredible capacity to shape our environment, physical environments, and then spend lots of time in those environments, which has an impact on our brain structure and function. We build with our brains digital environments in which we spend thousands and thousands of hours every year, which also has an impact to change the brain. So the point here is that if your environment shapes your brain, but we have the power to build certain environments and then choose which environments we spend most time in, we can therefore exert power over how our brains are shaped as the years and months go by. So, both physical and digital environments can change our brain. But there's no guarantee that it will always work out well, sadly. Here's a good example, anecdotal, I must admit. But in 2002, the driver of this car, who was blindly following sat-nav and leaving common sense by the wayside, followed it off the road down a country track that the farmer says, I don't even take my animals down there because it's so steep. And there's a 100-foot drop at the end of that barbed wire fence. So, this is an example of relying too heavily on technology. You might think this sign is a joke. They're up all over the city of Mulberry in Florida, USA, because kids come out of school, heads down on their smartphones, and they just step out in front of moving traffic. So the drivers need to be warned. It's not just in the States, in cities in Australia, Belgium, Germany, Israel, South Korea. These smartphone-friendly crossings have been installed. The idea being that people head down, not paying the blindest bit of attention to their surroundings, will see the line appear underneath their phone screen, and that will hopefully make them look up before they step in front of moving traffic. I like to call them digital lemmings. So that's a bit of anecdotal evidence that we might be overusing our technologies. 5 years ago, I was going to write a book about technology on the brain, and I kind of went through all the relevant research, psychology, neuroscience literature. And there were clues that excessive smartphone use might be having a negative impact on our attention, on our empathy, on our ability to remember what we've looked at and listened to. But it was early days. I had a look back into the literature last September, October, November, December, and there's so much evidence. So I'm not gonna share it all with you because there's no time. I want to get onto the Gen AI part of it. But the mere presence of your phone in your peripheral vision, even if the phone is switched off, is enough to derail your cognitive processing power when you're doing a complex task. So even if you don't pick it up, even if you don't interact with it, just knowing that there's all sorts of distraction there is enough to cause you to make more mistakes, do the work to a less high standard, and take longer to complete the task. So the takeaway here is out of sight is out of mind. There's lots of other examples I could give you of how excessive smartphone use isn't good for us, but I'm going to shift gears into the idea of tech multitasking. So this is a study that came out in 2009. We've got our low media multitaskers here, the square data points. We've got the heavy media multitaskers here in the triangular data points. Heavy media multitaskers are people who will rarely just watch television. They'll have a laptop out on their lap, simultaneously surfing the internet. They'll pick up their smartphone every now and again to check their social media notifications, so on and so forth. What does this graph mean? So we've got the number of distractors along the x-axis in a really simple visual task. You've got a bunch of oriented lines, and they disappear, reappear, and one of those lines has either changed orientation or it hasn't. It couldn't be easier. Simple visual task. But as you can see, the heavy media multitaskers, they can handle no distractors and 2 distractors, no problem at all. But when you add 4 distractors, their performance level declines. And when you add 6, it declines significantly. Okay, so this was the early clue that neuroplasticity might be inducing unhelpful changes. If technology is used unthinkingly is the point. If you just use it to the max, then it might end up causing you to regret your actions. If you were doing this up until 5 years ago, we simply didn't know it was this bad for you. But now you know. Probably not a great idea to do heavy media multitasking. From time to time, why not? But just don't do it all the time. Typically, people who are heavy medium multitaskers will cycle their attention between their screens once every 15 seconds. So that shows you how little they're processing each medium. So 2009 was a long time ago. Lots of research has gone into heavy medium multitasking. And so I'm going to give you the kind of highlights. Distractibility's gone up. So conversely, sustained attention, capacity to focus for long periods of time has gone down amongst heavy medium multitaskers. Impulsivity's gone up. Long-term memory is poorer. Working memory, the ability to hold information in mind for long enough to do something with it, is poorer in heavy medium multitaskers. Fluid intelligence has gone down. And then on a mental health front, they have a higher incidence of depression, a higher incidence of social anxiety, and, believe it or not, a higher incidence of neuroticism. So each of these individual data points isn't necessarily proof that heavy medium multitasking is changing their brain. But I would argue that put it all together, and it seems pretty clear that that type of, that manner of interacting with your environment is not particularly good for you. There's so much that we could discuss just talking about Gen AI, but I want to make some broad brushstrokes because it is too early to say anything for sure, right? But I think it's very clear that if you've used Gen AI, you know that work gets done faster, yeah? And that means that the impact on the typical human worker is that the time isn't spent doing the work from scratch on the whole, it's usually spent reviewing the work that Gen AI has done, or at least I hope that's what you're doing, because of Gen AI's famous hallucinations, right? At the end of the day, as much as the leaders of these companies would like you to believe that it's intelligent, it's not. They tokenize everything, turn it into numbers, generate responses based on statistical patterns, so an input sequence of words and then a reasonable sounding output sequence of words, but there is no understanding in there. Even OpenAI themselves have admitted that with their very latest models, if there is a factually correct answer and only one answer to a question, even ChatGPT 4.5 will get it wrong 1 in 3 times, right? It's deeply flawed, but the lay press would have you believe that it's genius and it's going to steal your job. So the other impact is that there is a huge increase in output, and it's frankly overwhelming. And I alluded to this, like there's just too much Gen AI, generated content out there, and there's too much. There is too much to check it all, but you need to. Now, sadly, there's this phenomenon, psychological phenomenon amongst humans called cognitive miserliness. Essentially, if we can find a shortcut, we will take a shortcut, right? It's tempting to just sack it off. It was probably fine. Just go to the pub early or something, but that is such a dangerous thing to do. And I'll go into early clues as to why it's really not advisable to do that. These are just some basic recommendations with regard to Gen AI. I would highly encourage you to continue experimenting with the tools of generative AI. And I would encourage you to be incredibly distrustful of all its outputs. And in order to sort of convince yourself of how shaky it is in terms of generating reliable stuff, test it on something that you're already an expert in. If you were going to go on Mastermind, you have a specialist subject that you know huge amounts about, ask it to write you a synopsis of that thing that you know about. When I do this with neuroscience, impact of technology on the brain, I've read all the papers. 7 of the items would be like, wow, that is uncanny. You are bang on the money. And a lot of that stuff only came out in the last couple of years. So that is, top marked, brilliant. There'll be 3 items out of every 10, which are like stunning. I was like, how did I miss that? That is so important for me to be able to tell audiences about that. And I'll say, give me some research on it, give me some references. And it'll confidently deliver me the references. And then I'll read the references. And there'll be absolutely no mention of that factoid in that, right? So don't take it from me. Take it from Dame Victoria Shah, president of the King's Bench, quoted in The Guardian earlier this month about LLMs, generative AI. Such tools can produce apparently coherent and plausible responses to prompts. But those coherent and plausible responses may turn out to be entirely incorrect. The responses may make confident assertions that are simply untrue. I've certainly experienced that. Cite sources that do not exist, purport to quote passages from a genuine source that do not appear in that source. That's the worst thing. It takes me like half an hour and hours to read these neuroscience papers, and to get all the way through it and find no mention of the thing that it purported to be in there is so frustrating. Anyway, the point is double check everything. If you want to keep your job and you don't want to accidentally churn out something that is proven to be completely demonstrably wrong, check everything. Don't be afraid. YouTube's your friend. There's loads of people who want to teach you how to use the latest tools. Don't blindly trust what the Gen AI fans say, because there's lots of people who just say, yeah, everything's brilliant, and they're not at all critical. I would highly recommend finding someone to teach you how to use it on YouTube who's a data scientist or generative AI specialist. They're really good at stress testing it and will point out the flaws and the places where it's useful, reliable, places where it's awful. And then moving on to the final topic, which I'm about to get onto, which is don't overuse Gen AI if you want to keep your brain in good order. So lazy Gen AI is going to result in poor outcomes. So this is very anecdotal, but if you remember, use it or lose it. Apparently it goes for stringing a sentence together. So this is a guy called Greg Eisenberg. He's got very popular social media and podcasts because he gives away startup ideas. I'll read it out. Just had a fascinating lunch with a 22-year-old Stanford grad, smart kid, perfect resume. Something felt off though. He kept pausing mid-sentence, searching for words. Not complex words, basic ones, like his brain was buffering. Finally asked if he was okay, and his response flawed. Sometimes I forget words now. I'm so used to having ChatGPT complete my thoughts that when it's not there, my brain feels slower. So if you lean on ChatGPT to that extent, you might struggle to string a coherent sentence together. That is highly worrying. Leaning too hard on Gen AI could make you seem professionally incompetent. So this came out in February of this year. Reuters, AI hallucinations and court papers spell trouble for lawyers. Some plaintiffs' house burned down because of a dodgy e-scooter. They wanted to sue Walmart. The lawyers, being lazy, got ChatGPT to find a bunch of relevant cases, blindly submitted them to the judge. Turned out 6 of them didn't exist. Wasn't the first time it happened. It happened the year before, and in 2023 was the first evidence I could find this happen. 9 of the 45 cases submitted by a lawyer in New York City just did not exist. It's not they existed, they're irrelevant, they did not exist. So you'll notice that 1 in 3 roughly thing, it comes up again and again. It's very flawed. But this, I think, is the most worrying. The erosion of critical thinking. It's a paper that came out in January. Deep interviews with 666 people about their generative AI use. The findings revealed a significant negative correlation between frequent AI tool usage and critical thinking abilities. In other words, the more people use Gen AI on a daily basis, the worse their critical thinking skills. And the reason I find that absolutely terrifying is because of cognitive miserliness. People will tend to use it to do harder and harder, sort of the more complicated, hard work things. People will lean on it harder. But critical thinking is the skill you use when you realize you're being manipulated. So if you apply this to society as a whole, if everyone overuses Gen AI, then we'll all be manipulated and we'll have no idea that it's happening. I find that kind of worrying. Anyway, I'll leave you with this. To avoid Gen brain, avoid your inner cognitive miser. Humans have a strong preference for the route of least resistance, but cognitive abilities are only bolstered and supported and reinforced if you maintain them with regular practice, which means it's easy. Just do it yourself from scratch from time to time. Don't always do it the long way. And by all means, lean on tools of generative AI. They're amazing. Moderate use. In all these technologies, it's fine. It's those who go to the absolute excesses that end up screwing themselves up. Cognitive offloading too much work to Gen AI means the erosion of vitally important cognitive abilities, not just critical thinking, right? But critical thinking, I think, is the one that we must guard most closely because it's so important to getting along in life as a human. So that's it. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoy it.